Welcome everyone to the Talking Animals, Law and Philosophy series. This is the second event in our series this term. My name is Raphael Fazel. I am the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. I take it some people might be joining for the first time, so I'm just going to say a few words about housekeeping, the format of the Talking Animals series. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes, and that will give us around about 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion after the talk. The event itself will end at 6:30 p.m. UK time, although I understand that that may translate into a different time depending on where you're zooming in from. Everyone's warmly invited to participate in the discussion. If you'd like to come in, could I please encourage you to use the raise hand function? You'll find that under the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom app. If for some reason you can't find that button, you can also use the chat box. But I think it makes for a nicer discussion if people raise their hands and then can ask their question or make their comment directly themselves. Until we reach the discussion, I will have all the microphones, except our speakers, of course, on mute. We will record the presentation bit of this event, not, however, the conversation discussion part, and you can later find that recording on our website. Okay, I think this is all, and I can now turn to introducing our terrific speaker today, and that's Claire Jean Kim. Claire Jean Kim is Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches classes on race, politics, and human-animal studies. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black Korean Conflict, published with Yale University Press in 2000, where she did graduate studies, as well as the book Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, published with Cambridge University Press in 2015, and one of my personal favorites. Her third book, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, came out just in September this year with Cambridge University Press. Professor Kim is a leading expert on the connections between animals and race, and she's explored these knotty topics and their intersection with tremendous rigor, nuance, and also openness, I think. In her presentation today, she will discuss with us a problem that she's identified in her work, namely that the fight for animals can potentially reproduce a form of racial violence that may contribute to the surge in fascism that we're seeing. Professor Kim, thanks so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Fazel, for inviting me to speak today. I'm so happy to see my friend and colleague and fellow poet, Jane Desmond. Thank you so much, Jane, for logging on. So my talk, as you can see, is entitled The Fight for Animals in a Moment of Danger.
I can't see the slides yet, just to
okay.
let you know.
Thank you. Go ahead and do that. Oops, okay. Can you see them?
Yes, we can see them now.
There's a lot of talk today in the US public sphere about democracy being endangered by the creeping threat of fascism. I take issue with this narrative, not because I don't agree that far-right, ultranationalist, authoritarian ideologies pose a clear and present danger in the US and around the world, because I do, but because I don't believe the US had a realized, intact democracy in the first instance. Along with many Black studies scholars, I believe the foundational reality of structural anti-Blackness, by which I mean the phobic hatred and avoidance of Blackness, which is our ongoing inheritance from centuries of racial slavery, has always betrayed the promise of democracy and the rule of law. It has always reflected a strain of racist authoritarian thinking in US politics, one that predates the 20th century when the word fascism became part of our lexicon. This is why in his 1943 poem, Beaumont to Texas, Langston Hughes points out that Hitler and Mussolini learned from the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group that originated in the US South in the mid-1800s. This is why in the late 1960s, the Black Panther Party spelled America with 3 Ks for KKK. As a racial capitalist state, born in and sustained by anti-Black violence, the U.S. contains what we call fascism as a structural tendency. This moment of danger, in other words, has been going on for a very long time. At the same time, at the level of contingent events, we could say the moment of danger is intensifying. Today, fascist ideologies speak powerfully to the fears, resentments, and hatreds felt by those facing the precarity and hardship generated by neoliberal capitalism and climate catastrophe. It is not a coincidence that the coup attempted by white supremacist groups at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, came in the wake of two historical events: the Obama presidency and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers 6 months prior. Here we see one of the January 6th insurrectionists carrying a Confederate flag, of course, harkening back to the U.S. Confederacy during the Civil War. He's standing inside the U.S. Capitol building, and the portrait is one of John Calhoun, who was a former U.S. vice president and a Southerner and a stalwart defender of racial slavery. Black political assertion of any kind arouses a ferocious white rage that expresses itself in, but cannot be contained by, racial nationalist mythologies of white loss, displacement, and regeneration. It remains to be seen whether this rage will once again lift Donald Trump into the Oval Office. We are at a historical conjuncture where the threat of fascism looms across the globe. In Hungary, Italy, Brazil, the Philippines, India, France, Germany, and elsewhere, we see indicators that authoritarianism, cults of personality, and ethno-nationalism are on the rise. At the same time, the UN estimates more than 700 million climate refugees will be fleeing their homelands by 2050. We have watched as Central American refugees attempted to cross the southern border of the US. We have watched as North African refugees attempt to cross the Mediterranean into southern Europe. As these trickles turn into floods, will fascist solutions of extreme violence be displayed or deployed? What scenes of horror lie ahead? I'm interested in thinking today about where the animal liberation movement sits in relation to these political scenarios. Specifically, I want to talk about the movement's tendency to bracket off the animal question, silo it off as a thing unto itself, or at best to analogize to or connect to other social justice struggles through terms like intersectionality, without clarifying the relationship of animal politics to broader arrangements of power. This approach strikes me in the context of these urgent political developments I mentioned as misguided and possibly even dangerous. I'm concerned that the animal movement presently contributes to and has potential to contribute to the advancement of fascist ideology in the US and elsewhere, not only by ignoring or overlooking structural anti-Blackness, but by advancing concepts and arguments which actively disavow its existence and significance as a world-making force, thereby strengthening the hand of those committed to its reproduction. Interpreting the past is and always has been the very core of the struggle between fascism and democracy. And here, for the record, I want to say I'm including my own work on animals as involved in this tendency that I'm talking about. I've organized the talk around three main points and the conclusion. Before turning to the first point, let me acknowledge that talking about anti-Blackness and animals in the same breath, especially in this kind of setting, runs the risk, perversely, of reinforcing the Black Animal Association. This is especially true when the speaker is a person like myself who holds the advantage of not Blackness. At the same time, I believe it is vital for not Black scholars to take on these issues while learning from, amplifying, and lifting up the voices of Black thinkers and activists who are talking and writing about them. We cannot sit back and put the entire burden on our Black colleagues. It is difficult to discuss these issues. It is necessary that we do so. The first point I want to make today is that the animal liberation movement tends to bracket animal issues from the social political reality in which they're embedded. denying the world-making impact of structural anti-Blackness, among other things, and its profound entanglement with animal oppression. Race is relegated to a second-order differentiation, an intramural hierarchy among humans. The crucial example here is the concept of speciesism itself, which sits at the center of the struggle for animal liberation. In Animal Liberation, published in 1975, Peter Singer draws upon Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian philosophy to sketch an argument for animal liberation that does not depend on Kantian-type rights claims. Here he popularizes the word speciesism to indict the institutionalized violence inflicted upon animals through farming experimentation and other practices. Analogizing speciesism to racism and sexism in order to lend the animal movement legitimacy and gravitas, Singer defines speciesism as a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. This definition seems straightforward enough until one remembers structural anti-Blackness. As an empirical matter, white people and not Black people generally do not consistently favor the interests of Black people above those of other species. They do not consistently recognize Black people as being fully human. In the white imagination, Blackness is, as philosopher psychiatrist Frantz Fanon wrote, a species distinction. Animals are not the only beings excluded, then, from the human with a capital H. Thus, what Giorgio Agamben has called the anthropological machine of humanism is not the only machine involved in making the human. There is also racial slavery, which Frank Wilderson writes in his book Red, White, and Black, creates an ontological rupture between the human, capital H, and the Black, or the slave, rendering the Black, quote, the very antithesis of a human subject, unquote, the counterpoint against which the human can gain coherence and knowledge of self. We could say then that the human, capital H, is in the modern world is paradigmatically both not animal and not Black, requiring the presence of both the animal and the Black to locate itself. Consider this well-known sketch from Josiah Nott and George Glidden's Types of Mankind or Ethnological Researches, based upon the Ancient Monuments, Paintings, Sculptures, and Crania of Races, 1854. This sketch gives visual form to the great chain of being, the text structuring Western ontological imaginings for hundreds of years. Unlike Ernst Haeckel, the German naturalist, who clutters his great chain diagram with Fuegians, Chinese, and other extraneous figures, Nott and Glidden present a truncated chain, the core segment of the chain, if you will, in order to focus our attention on three principal characters: the European man, the Negro, and the chimpanzee. Next to each head, a corresponding skull. The logic of the chain, as Arthur Lovejoy has shown, is one of continuous graduated difference. Thus, the Negro is formally equidistant in the sketch from the European above and the chimpanzee below. Yet the figures are drawn in such a way that the Negro looks uncannily like the chimpanzee, and both of these look remarkably different from the figure on top, a chasm made more pronounced by the fact that the figure on top is not a representation of a generic European man, but a representation of a celebrated classical marble sculpture of Apollo, the god of music, reason, and the sun. Consider, too, these lesser-known sketches from the opposing page in the same volume. These figures depict different ape species and Negroes from varying places and periods. There is no European man or divine stand-in in sight. What is of interest in this page is Negro-ape nearness. Yes, the Negro is intermediate between human and animal, but the Negro is also quite a bit closer to the animal than to the human, unspeakably close. We see here how Blackness and animalness form poles in a closed loop of meaning. Blackness is a species construct, meaning in proximity to the animal. And animalness is a racial construct, meaning in proximity to the Black. And the two are dynamically interconstituted all the way down. It may be we have not two distinct taxonomies of power race and species, but one taxonomy with two dimensions or registers, what I've called elsewhere a zoologo-racial order. It's an order in which everything human, again with a capital H, depends upon keeping the relationship between the black and the animal unspeakably close and perpetually open, which is why we cannot stop posing the question, is the black animal? It is not the answer to the question, but rather the infinite repetition of the question and the deferral of the answer that fixes the closed loop of meaning in which both imagined entities, black and animal, are produced as indeterminate relative to one another, the distance between them permanently unspecifiable. The ontological certainty of the human depends on the blurred ontological line between black and animal. For more on this, let me take you to the Cincinnati Zoo in the state of Ohio in May 2016, where a small black boy who's 3 years old fell into the enclosure of the gorilla Harambe, and the zoo called out its sharpshooters who shot Harambe dead. Before the shooting, Harambe approached the boy, as you can see here, and held his hand, positioning himself between the boy and the screaming crowd. Still, zookeepers dispatched sharpshooters who shot him dead, and this act unleashed a tsunami of hatred against the boy and his parents in white cyberspace. By choosing the black child over the gorilla, by declaring that Black life matters more than gorilla life, the zoo's sharpshooters answered the question that culturally speaking must be kept open: is the black animal? What made the killing of Harambe a collective trauma for white people was how it resutured the black boy into the human, putting back together, via the barrel of a gun and only for a moment, what racial slavery had torn asunder. Even the single act of killing Harambe to protect a black child produced an intense cultural distortion, a collective wave of nausea. And so Harambe memes replicated furiously in the aftermath of that day, restitching the social fabric by reopening the question of black animal nearness. So we see these different images. I left out the images which were quite common, which sexualized Harambe and evoked the sexualization of black men that was, of course, historically tied to the act of lynching. Rendered black here, Harambe is elevated and debased at once, vaulted into and out of human status in the same gesture. In this unfolding semiotic play, the ruptured loop of interconstituted race-species meaning is repaired, fragment by fragment, until once again, we cannot tell where blackness ends and apeness begins. Order has been restored. The murder of Harambe and its aftermath show us the limits of the concept of speciesism. It is not at all clear, in fact, that black people are preferred to non-human animals. We need a new way of conceptualizing animal liberation, one that takes as a departure point this entanglement of race and species. The second point I want to make today is that the animal liberation movement tells us that racial slavery is over and that the black struggle has been a success. The better to use these as key props in the fight for animals. Thus, in addition to disavowing structural anti-blackness, the animal movement instrumentalizes it, which is why some people think animal liberation throws black people under the bus to advance its own goals. We can go all the way back to the 18th century to observe this trend. Consider Jeremy Bentham's moral extensionist framework. The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. The French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may come one day to be recognized that the number of the legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison, a more rational as well as a more conversable animal, than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise. What would it avail? The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Bentham's overly sanguine appraisal of French commitments to racial equality must have come as a surprise to those living under French colonial rule at the time, including but not limited to the African slaves in Saint-Domingue, who were just then on the eve of a slave revolt that would change the world. But that is the subject of another talk. My point here is that Bentham prematurely announces the resolution of the race issue in order to use this as an example of success for the animal movement. And this is symptomatic of animal liberation discourse to this day. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. In Marjorie Spiegel's book, The Dreaded Comparison, Human and Animal Slavery, 1988, Marjorie Spiegel invokes the slave-animal analogy by juxtaposing slave and animal images. PETA imitated this approach in the early 2000s in two controversial traveling exhibits, We Are All Animals and Holocaust on Your Plate. Spiegel provides very few captions or explanatory comments to go along with the images, as if we need only see them in close proximity to understand what they mean, that these are analogous oppressions, expressions of the same drive for domination. The female slave in the scold's bridle and the muzzled dog, the pilloried slave and the monkey in a laboratory restraint, and here the male slave in a spiked collar and the rabbit immobilized for cosmetics testing. Like all visual images, though, Spiegel's images are unruly, jumping the interpretive frame and subverting the message. As a project that analogizes the animal to the slave, animal liberation raises and tries to repress a series of disjunctures and contradictions between the status of the slave and that of the animal. How the difference between slave and animal was imagined and understood, say, in the 19th century, how recognition of this difference was built into law and practice, and how this shaped the forms of violence and coercion inflicted upon slaves and animals respectively. These are the questions that Spiegel's juxtaposed images bring to mind, even though her analogical framework forbids them. All we need to know about the slave from Spiegel's vantage point is that he was treated like an animal. And crucially, that he stopped being a slave at some point. To place animals center stage, animal liberation relentlessly displaces the issue of anti-Blackness, deflecting attention from the specificity of the slave status then and mystifying the question of the Black person status now. According to the animal movement's narrative of racial temporality, Black people at some point, variously emancipation, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, moved demonstrably from slavery to freedom, from the outside in, from abjection to inclusion. They were resutured into the human. Animals, by contrast, remain in their original state of abjection. Spiegel writes, hearkening back to the passage from Bentham quoted above, the following. Most members of our society have reached the conclusion that it was and is wrong to treat Blacks like animals. But with regard to the animals themselves, most still feel that it is acceptable to treat them to some degree or another in exactly the same manner. A line was arbitrarily drawn between white people and Black people, a division which has since been rejected. But what of the line which has been drawn between human and non-human animals? Animal liberation takes as an operating premise the putative resolution of racial slavery as a problem of history. The angel of history moves with extensionist purpose down the rungs of the great chain of being, or if one prefers a different spatial metaphor, outward toward the farthest rings of the concentric circles of moral considerability. And crucial to the success of what the angel wants to do, liberate animals, is what she has already done, banish racial slavery. Animals can be recognized as the new slaves only if the old slaves have vacated their position. In his article, The New Abolitionism, Capitalism, Slavery, and Animal Liberation, Stephen Best, too, tries to displace racial injustice as the moral dilemma of our time, as we can see in these two passages. The horrors of slavery were the burning ethical and political issue of modern capitalism. Over a century after the liberation of Blacks in the 1880s, however, slavery has again emerged as a focal point of debate and struggle as society shifts from considering human to animal slaves, and a new abolitionist movement seeking animal liberation emerges as a flashpoint for moral evolution and social transformation. Moral advance today involves sending human supremacy to the same refuse bin that society earlier discarded much male supremacy and white supremacy. Animal liberation is the culmination of a vast historical learning process whereby human beings gradually realize that arguments justifying hierarchy, inequality, and discrimination of any kind are arbitrary, baseless, and fallacious. Having recognized the illogical and unjustifiable rationales used to oppress Blacks, women, and other disadvantaged groups, society is beginning to grasp that speciesism is another unsubstantiated form of oppression and discrimination. In the first quote, Best proclaims a new abolitionist movement, as if the original abolitionist movement were not still at work today, still seeking the emancipation and racial equality promised centuries ago, speaking out against the prison industrial complex, daring to imagine a world beyond the violence of property, police, and capitalism. In the second quote, Best's teleological language suggests that moral extensionism is an imminent force in history, or that history itself is the unfolding of collective reason and enlightenment. Racism has been recognized as a moral error. Animal slavery is next. Again, rumors of the death of anti-Blackness are greatly exaggerated. Animal abolition gestures toward the moral centrality of Black oppression, but only after it relegates it to the past. The insistence upon displacing Black subjugation so that we can get on with the business of saving animals creates a boomerang effect. Black subjugation is sent back into the past only to return to the present with greater force as a challenge to the project of animal liberation. The more animal liberation grounds itself upon the denial of structural anti-Blackness, the less moral authority it commands, and the less chance it has of mounting a successful movement for change. In their book, Animal Rights, The Abolitionist Approach, 2015, animal liberationists Gary Francione and Anna Charlton condemn reformism, welfarism, which the authors explain undermine the animal's cause by sanctioning their property status and telling the public they can have their beef and eat it too. Abolitionism for Francione and Charlton is the refusal to succumb to these lies, the insistence that immoral institutions must be opposed utterly. They write, quote, "We would all agree that beating one's slaves less is better than beating one's slaves more, but the institution of slavery is still morally wrong. No one would promote the humane treatment of slaves as something that would eradicate the injustice of the institution of slavery." Like Spiegel, Best, and others, Francione and Charlton raised the issue of racial slavery. Like the others, they're less interested in exploring the character of racial slavery than in pronouncing it dead and naming animal slavery as its successor. In this quote, they write, "We now accept that every human being, whatever their level of intelligence, talent, beauty, etc., holds a pre-legal moral right not to be treated as property. They have the right to be a moral person and not a thing. Yet we have not extended this right to animals. The principle of equal consideration says that we must treat similar interests similarly. Both humans and non-humans have an interest in not being treated exclusively as resources. This different treatment is speciesist." Given that people were not forced into the slavery in the US South because of a deficit of intelligence, talent, beauty, etc., but rather because of their Blackness, we can surmise that the authors are being deliberately abstract here so as to avoid the messiness of race. But the rhetorical dodge is symptomatic of animal liberation's overall difficulty with the issue. Francione and Charlton accept at face value official declarations of racial equality, which operate to conceal the murderous reality of anti-Blackness. In doing so, they disavow the truths that the Black freedom struggle, including its latest instantiation, Black Lives Matter, is continually striving to illuminate. The front cover of Francione and Charlton's book, Animal Rights, The Abolitionist Approach, 2015, features an image designed by artist Sue Coe. Several enchained figures encircle the earth, upon which rests a banner proclaiming abolition in large red letters, the only color in an otherwise black and white image. The figures include a cow, a lamb, a duck, a turkey, a rooster, a goose, a pig, and fish, are all animals bred and raised for human consumption, except for the two humans at the bottom, a Black woman slave holding a banner featuring a picture of an enchained black fist, and a kneeling male slave with shackled wrists outstretched. The latter is immediately recognizable as a replication of the engraving by potter Josiah Wedgwood, which became an iconic image of 18th century abolitionism. Animal slaves, black slaves. Now take a look at Sue Koh's artwork on the back cover of this book. Here we see the joys of a liberated world. Unchained animals encircle and embrace the earth. Oh, I'm going to pull up that image. And the banner that used to say abolition now says vegan. The sun rises red and strong in the upper right corner, signaling the start of a new day, and the lit sky is strewn with stars. But where have the Black people gone? They are nowhere to be seen. In a new world where liberation is defined as universal veganism, it cannot be depicted. To show them as before would highlight the fact that veganism did not secure their liberation. To show them standing free and unbowed would raise the question of how veganism could have secured their liberation. So they have been disappeared. Which leads to my third and final point. The third point I want to make is that if animal liberation stays on its current course, it will continue to contribute to the erasure of structural anti-Blackness, thus furthering fascist ideologies and their fantasies of white loss and regeneration. This is troubling news since most of us animal people are adamantly opposed to fascist politics. Fascist ideologies depend upon the construction of racial nationalist mythologies of white loss and regeneration. They comprehensively reconstruct history and memory in service of this project. Every nation downplays its founding acts of violence, and fascism amplifies this tendency. This is why students in the US and around the world are denied the truth about what racial slavery was and how it shapes the world we live in. The ongoingness of racial slavery, as captured by Saidiya Hartman's concept of slavery's afterlife, is and must be obscured for white loss and redemption to take center stage. Okay, so I do not have the rest of my notes, so I think I'm going to go through the few remaining slides and then turn off the slides and turn to my notes. Okay, so here we see Republican state-led state legislatures in the US have been trying to ban what they call critical race theory in schools, K through 12 and higher education. And they define this variously, sometimes as anything that makes the nation look bad or puts the nation in a bad light, or anything that makes white people feel guilty. So you can see that in the right-hand image, a girl holding up a sign, "I am not an oppressor." And on the left, we can see a map. This is current as of 2021 of states where CRT is banned, restricted, the bans were attempted, etc. And you can see this is mostly happening in the South, a little bit in the West and Midwest within the US. So this is a very important aspect of the fascist project, right, to suppress the truth of slavery so that they can create a different kind of narrative centering on white loss. I'm going to come back to this in a moment when I talk about ecofascism. This is the character known as the QAnon shaman, and he was an important figure in the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol in 2021. He was convicted and jailed on federal charges, and he has said that when he gets out of jail, he plans to run for Congress from his state of Arizona. And given the state of Arizona, you know, it is possible he will be elected to the House of Representatives. He is an eco-fascist. He is somebody who has been a climate activist and talking about race and climate together, promoting the eco-fascist line that non-white hordes are coming to disrupt and take over our natural resources, disrupting the natural relationship between white people and animals, white people and the land, white people and nature. So ecofascism was an important aspect of the January 6th insurrection, even though it has not been talked about widely. Okay, so I'm going to come back to these slides and just exit for a moment so that I can, sorry about this little technical issue here. I'm going to come out of the slides for a moment. Okay, stop sharing. Okay. Okay. Let me see if I can. My cat is now distracting me as I attempt to get these slides together. Okay, I'm just going to read to you from the rest of the slides so that we can continue. Okay. Okay, so following up on this third point about animal liberation contributing to the erasure of structural anti-Blackness, then I wanted to bring up a few examples of Black thinkers and Black scholars whose work is, I think, pointing us in the direction of how we might reimagine animal liberation in relation to Black freedom. So this book is recent. I think it was published in 2020 or 2021 by Zakiya Jackson, Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World. And here she writes, African diasporic cultural production intervenes productively in reconsidering the role of the animal or the animalistic in the construction of the human by producing non-binaristic models of human-animal relations, advancing theories of trans-species interdependency, observing trans-species precarity, and hypothesizing cross-species relationality in a manner that preserves alterity while undermining the non-human and animalities abjection, an abjection that constantly rebounds on marginalized humans. Similarly, Joshua Bennett, in his book, Being Property Once Myself, Blackness and the End of Man, writes, the ways in which the Black aesthetic tradition provides us with the tools needed to conceive of interspecies relationships anew and ultimately to abolish the forms of anti-Black thought that have maintained the fissure between human and animal, unquote. What does the animal promise? Nothing short of another cosmos, a radically different set of relations. Bennett notes that Black authors, quote, turn to the animal kingdom, that which had so often been used as a tool of their derision and punishment, as a site of futurity and fugitivity. And one of the things Bennett does in this book is reread some very important Black authors through this lens, focusing on how they talk about futurity and fugitivity in relation to the animal. And finally, I would cite Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, A Guide to Getting Out, with reference to Jordan Peele's movie Get Out, by AFCO, where she writes, asks, does the animal need to be freed from the animal movement as currently constituted? She points out that Black expressive culture and thought offer a meaningful alternative to the way the fight for animals is thought and conducted today. And all of this leads to what she describes as Afro-zoological resistance, defined as anti-racist activism that explicitly interrogates animality. So starting, instead of intersectionality, which she sees as a reaching across the aisle once the animal liberation movement has constituted itself, or reaching across the aisle to other struggles, she's suggesting that we go back to the basics and reconceive animal liberation and other movements as tied fundamentally from the beginning, including in particular with this idea of Afro-zoological resistance, animal liberation, and Black liberation. And then at the end, I wanted to just ask if we were to follow AFCO's advice, if we were to take seriously the possibility that as human advocates, we are not doing what we need to for animals because of our own blinders, our own shortcomings, and our own fears. If we were to take this idea seriously, then and try to imagine a new kind of animal liberation project that takes seriously structural anti-Blackness and the movement for Black liberation, how might we reimagine the back cover of Francione and Charlton's book, right? How might we, if we were to talk to the artist Sue Coe and commission a new back cover, what would it look like? Okay, thank you very much. Open to questions.